Hi, my name is Matri Majumdar. I'm a second year electrical engineering student, and I'm just creating a quick tutorial video for loops in MATLAB. If you're in Dr. Whitehead's class right now, this homework assignment is going to be due soon. So I just wanted to go over the first problem really quickly, just so you guys have a head start. All right, so this problem specifically is going through for loops, right? So this question is asking to write a script that will calculate each of the following sums using a for loop, right? And all of these numbers, I know they look really intimidating and really daunting and everything, but I promise for loops are not a big deal, and they're actually pretty easy once you get a handle on them. Cool. So before I start, let's just quickly go through what a for loop is. A for loop essentially traverses through a given vector. So in a for loop, sorry. So if I wanted to write a for loop right now, I'd write for, and then I create a variable for my vector. Right now, I'm just calling it I. Obviously, you can call it whatever you want to call it. And I'm just going to create a quick vector from 1 to 10, right? And it's giving me an error right now because I don't have an end statement. But after I just want to display this vector right now, and then I will end it and we will have no error. Great. So what this I vector is doing right now is this I vector is creating a vector from 1 through 10. And what this for loop is going to do is it's going to traverse through every single element in the vector. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, all the way up to 10, right? So if we display this vector right now, it's going to show you 1 through 10. Great. All right, so now say I don't want it from 1 to 10, I can make the beginning number and the ending number anything I want to be, but for now it has to be the beginning number has to be less than the ending number. So I can't go and make this 100. Otherwise, I'm either going to get an error or an empty vector. So yes, as you can see here, I have an empty vector. Should probably clear the command window. I'll run it again. Yeah, I have an empty vector here. So, but what if I don't want it from 1 to, what if I don't want it to count up by 10? Here, if you do it with only 2 numbers, it's always going to count up by 1. If let's say I wanted to count up by 2, I'm going to do 2. I'm just going to input another 2 and separate it with another colon. So now I should get just 5 numbers in my vector. So yes, 1, 3, 5, and it's counting up by 2 because 1 plus 2 is 3, 3 plus 2 is 5, etc. Right? I could even make it count up by 0.2 if I wanted to. Oops. And look, it's counting up by 0.2 for every single thing. And lastly, if I wanted it to count down, so I'm just going to make this beginning number bigger than the larger number. And if I wanted to count down by a -2, we're just going to put a -2 here. And now it's counting down by -2. Great. So you're probably asking yourself, what's the point of the for loop and everything? So the for loop is mostly used to traverse through other arrays or other vectors. So if I had another vector and I wanted to, if I wanted to find the product of each value in the vector or something like that, I would use a for loop to traverse through my given vector and find the product of each thing. The number one thing to remember for a for loop, though, is you always have to know like what numbers you're going through. I know for a while loop, you can say while x is less than 5 or something like that, and you can keep reiterating until x is equal to 5. But for a for loop, you have to know what's your ending number and what's your beginning number at the very least, right? The middle number doesn't really matter that much. You can make the middle number whatever you want to, but you have to know what your beginning number is and what your ending number is. All right, great. So let me clear everything really quick. And now let's go back to our actual problem. So if we look at part A, they want us to sum from, they want us to create a vector from 1 to this number right here to create a sum of this number, right? And we will have to sum each and every single element in the vector, right? All right, so the way this is done, it's a little tricky if you're not really used to for loops and summing things in for loops, but I will walk you through it. So first things first, I'm going to create a value called sum, and I'm just going to set it equal to 0 because in MATLAB, we can't leave these things empty. I know this is a little weird right now, but believe me, it's going to make sense in a minute. So now the main part, we have to create a for loop, and we know that we have to create a for loop from 1 to 9,999. So how do we do that? We write for, we create our variable. I'm going to call this a, let's say, for a equals 1 through 9,999. Great. And we know that it's counting up by 1 because we didn't add any middle number here. If we did, it would count up by that middle number, count up or down by that middle number. All right. So now what I'm going to do here, I'm going to say sum equals sum plus a. And then I'm going to end it. And then I'm going to just... I know that was a little quick, so let me just explain what happened right here. So right now sum is at 0. So right now here sum is at 0, and then sum is at 0 here as well, but then a is at 1, right? So then sum equals 0 plus 1. 0 plus 1 is 1. So now sum equals 1. And now that sum equals 1, we're going to go back to the for loop and we're going to continue this vector. So we started with 1, and since it's counting out by 1, we're going to go to 2. So now sum equals whatever the previous value of sum was, which was 1. So now sum equals 1 plus 2 because a is now 2, and sum should equal 3. So I can make this a little bit more clear by establishing a breakpoint here. And if you notice the workspace over here, you would be able to see how a and sum are changing. So right now a is 1, sum is 0 because we set sum equal to 0, and a starts at 1 because that's where our vector starts. So if you continue it, now a is at the second value and sum equals 1 because 0 plus 1 equals 1, right? So now we should get a value of 3 for sum because 2 plus 1 equals 3. Great. And now, and we should see this continue. So these two should add up and sum should be the sum of both of those numbers. Great. And now 4 plus 6 equals 10. And it will continue like that forever until it gets to 999. Obviously, I'm not going to click it 999 times, but yeah. Now we can see if this actually works by running it, and we display it and we get this number right here. Let's just double check to make sure it matches. Yeah, looks like it matches. Great. Cool. So we got through the first thing. So now let's go through the second one. So let's go through part B really quick, right? So part B is a little different. Part B is not starting at 1 anymore. Part B is now starting at 500, and it's going up by 1 all the way to 1500. So that's the only difference here, but the concept otherwise remains the same. So we can initialize our sum, and now we can create a for loop. I'll call this B for part B. And most important thing for this problem, it's not starting at 1, it's starting at 500, and it's going up to 1500. Cool. So now A and B equals 500 all the way to 1500. Great. And now the concept from part A remains the same. Sum equals sum plus B, and then we end it and we display our sum value. Great. And like always, this is going to work the exact same way that part A worked before. So right now I'm just going to run it and we should get the same value as B from before. Great, so we have this number right here and it seems to match this number pretty well. Cool. So just remember the most important part is that you're not starting at 1, you're starting at 500 and it's counting up by 1, so it's going from, then the next value is 501, then it's 502 all the way to 1500. Let's go to part C. Okay, part C is a little tricky. I know it looks complicated with every other value being squared, but there is a way to get around this, and the way I would do it, which is not necessarily like the universal way to do it or anything, but the way I would do it is I would create 2 separate for loops. So I would create one for loop that counts from 500 to 502 to 505, etc. And I would create another for loop that counts from 501 to 503 to 505, etc., all the way to 1500. So the trick to this one is that, one of them is going to be counting up by 2s, and then they're both going to be counting up by 2s, and then this one is going to be starting at a different value, and it's still going to be counting up by 2s. If there's time left, I will show another way to do it as well with if statements, just because. All right, so let's first tackle the one that's not being squared, right? So 500, 502, 504, all the way to 1500, right? So we can still create our sum things, but here, just because we're creating 2 different for loops, let's create 2 different sum values. Let's call this sum C1 equals 0, and then sum C2 equals 0. Cool. So now let's count for all the even numbers up first. So let's call this, I'm just going to call this lowercase c. For lowercase c equals 500, and since we're counting up by 2s here, we need a 2 in the middle, and we're counting all the way to 1500. And then we can use the same thing. So let's just use our first sum value here. So sum C1 equals sum C1 plus lowercase c, and great. So now we have all the even values for this equation. So now let's tackle the odd values. Another tricky part of the odd values is that it's being squared, but don't worry, that's not going to make that big of a difference. So for the odd values, since we're starting at a different starting value, let's create a different for loop. So let's call this uppercase C equals, and notice we're starting at 501 here, but we're still counting up by 2. Because it goes from 501 to 503 to 505, all the way to 1500 again. Great. And all the way to 1500 again. So sum C2 equals sum C2. This is the only real difference so far. So now C is going to be squared just because all of these values are squared. So capital C squared. Oops, sorry. Capital C squared. And so now we have the sum. Now we have the sum for all of the even values that are not being squared. And now we have the sum for all of the odd values that are being squared. To find the total sum, let's just sum the 2 sums together. Cool. So sum C1, oops, sorry. I'm just going to call this sum. Let's call it total sum. Equals sum C1 plus sum C2, and let's display that. And we should get, yeah, we got the same value right here as we do right here. Great. Okay, cool. There is another way to do it with if statements. So another way to do it, another way I would do it specifically, is I would create one for loop that would go from 500 to, just really quickly, let me just go walk through that super quick. So one for loop that would go through 500 to 1500. And underneath that, I would create a quick if statement. So I would check if it's an odd number, if it's an even number. So if it's an even number, then if you divide it by 2, the remainder is always going to be 0. That's true for all even numbers. So if mod c comma 2 equals 0, then I would just sum them up. So then I would just do sum 1 equals sum c1 plus c else. So if it's an odd number, that's why it's else. And these are being squared, the odd numbers are being squared, so we have to keep that in mind. Sum c2 equals sum c2 plus c squared. Let's end the if statement. Let's end the for loop. And let's just display, oops, make a total sum variable. Total sum equals sum c1 plus sum c2 and display total. And hopefully we should get the same value. And great, we got the exact same value. So yeah, that was just 2 different ways to do the same problem. There's a million different ways to do these things, obviously. I just showed you 2 different ways in case you were interested. Okay, so let's get to this problem right here. This problem is obviously the toughest out of the 4 given in number 1, just because now there's like minus signs here, and another minus sign here. So and they're all odd numbers. So every other odd here is getting a minus sign. So the way I would do it, I would make 2 for loops, just like I did for part C. Okay, I would make one for loop that counts from 1 and that starts from 1 and counts by 4s, and these are all going to be positive. And then I create another for loop that starts from 3 and counts by 4s, and these are all going to be negative, and they're all going to be squared, and I would sum them all up to get this number right here. Great. So let's create our 2 sum statements. So sum d1 equals 0, and then sum d2 equals 0. All right. So let's first tackle the positive ones. So 1, 5, 9, etc. So first things first, we know that this is going up. We know that it's starting from 1, we know that it's going up by 4, and we know that it's going to end at 9,999. So let's call this lowercase d, 4d equals 1, counting up by 4, all the way to 9,999. So for all of these values, I want these values to sum up, and I want them all to be squared. So sum d1 equals sum d1 plus d squared. Great, and let's end that. And now let's create a second for loop for all of these negative odd numbers. And remember, this is starting from 3 and it's counting up by 4. So 3, 7, 11, all the way to 9,999. And these are all going to be negative, right? So for d equals, we're starting from 3 here, so my first value is going to be 3. I'm still counting up by 4, so that's going to be 4. And then 9,999, because that's our ending value. And now sum d2 equals sum d2 minus capital D squared. And the only reason I put the minus here is because all of these are getting subtracted from each other. And now with the semicolon, end it, and now let's find our total sum. Total sum equals sum d1 plus sum d2. And let's display our total sum. Oops, forgot to clear it. So hopefully this should give us the same value from that. And it looks like it did. Great. All right, so that was all of number one. I think number one went through pretty clearly how to like sum all these values and how to sum like different vectors and everything. Yeah, I hope that was helpful and good luck with everything in this class. Yeah, bye.